Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into a medical mystery wrapped inside a political thriller. It's the story of a man who executed a king, only to face his own executioner, one that came from within his own body. On September 3rd, 1658, Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, lay dying in Whitehall Palace. As a violent storm, one of the worst in living memory, battered London, his organs were failing one by one. His physicians, helpless, watched as the most powerful man in the British Isles succumbed to a relentless fever. After he died, they performed an autopsy. What they found inside his spleen was so disturbing they described it as looking like the dregs of oil, those thick, dark deposits that settle at the bottom of an oil jar. It was evidence of a long and brutal battle fought within his own body. But here's what makes this death truly extraordinary. Cromwell might have lived. The cure for his illness existed. It was available. His doctors even knew about it. Yet as the Lord Protector's body was consumed by fever, the one medicine that could have saved him sat untouched. Why? Because it came from his most hated enemies. To understand why England's most powerful man was allowed to die this way, we need to rewind the clock. We need to go back 9 years to the moment a disease first entered his bloodstream, a disease that would haunt him until his final breath. The year is 1649. Cromwell is marching his army through the marshlands of southern Ireland. The ground squelches beneath his boots, the air is thick with moisture and the constant, high-pitched buzz of mosquitoes. He is there on a brutal mission, to crush Catholic resistance and impose Protestant rule with the sword. Within weeks, he will oversee the infamous massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, acts that would stain his name forever. But Ireland would have its revenge, not on the battlefield, but in a far more insidious way. In October of that year, the fever struck him. It hit hard, leaving him, in his own words, "Very sick and crazy in my health." The Irish marshes had given him what physicians of the time called tertian ague, a recurring fever that appeared every third day. And here, the crucial thing about the type of malaria Cromwell likely contracted. Once it's in you, it can stay with you for life. It hides in the liver, it waits, and it re-emerges when you are at your weakest, when your immune system is compromised by stress, exhaustion, or another illness. For Cromwell, a man constantly under immense pressure, it was a ticking time bomb. 2 years later, in 1651, that bomb nearly detonated. While campaigning in Scotland, Cromwell fell desperately ill in Edinburgh. Cromwell himself believed he was at death's door. He wrote, "I thought I should have died of this fit of sickness," describing an illness so severe that, indeed, my nature was not able to bear the weight thereof. Imagine this scene. The man who had toppled a monarchy, the brilliant general who commanded an army that had never lost a single battle, was reduced to a shivering, sweating wreck in a Scottish castle. His officers gathered anxiously outside his chamber, whispering, wondering if they should start planning for a successor. The physicians tried everything in their 17th century arsenal. They applied leeches to bleed him, administered powerful purges to cleanse his system, and tried every known remedy. Somehow, against the odds, he pulled through. But survival isn't the same as recovery. The malaria parasites retreated back into his liver, dormant but not defeated. Cromwell was scarred by the experience. For the rest of his life, he was plagued by recurring bouts of illness, what he called his old complaint. He suffered from poor health, kidney stones, and chronic infections. Each time he fell sick, the hidden malaria parasites had an opportunity to strike again, weakening him further. Now, let's fast forward to 1658, the final year of his life. The pressures on Cromwell are immense. He is ruling as a virtual king, but without the legitimacy of one. He faces constant threats of assassination from royalists, plots from religious extremists, and political opposition from a parliament he can't seem to control. His body is worn out from decades of campaigning and the immense stress of leadership. Then, tragedy strikes. In August, his favorite daughter, Elizabeth, dies a slow and agonizing death, likely from cancer. Cromwell is devastated. He stays by her bedside for weeks, barely eating or sleeping. This profound grief is the final blow to his already weakened immune system. It's the perfect storm for the malaria parasites to launch their final fatal assault. Shortly after Elizabeth's death, Cromwell falls ill with the familiar fever. But this time is different. This time, his body has no strength left to fight. The tertian ague returns with a vengeance. His doctors, the most respected physicians in England, are summoned to his bedside. They recognize the symptoms immediately. It's the same recurring fever that nearly killed him in Scotland. And this is where the story takes its most fascinating turn. Because by 1658, there was a new miraculous cure making waves across Europe. It was a reddish-brown powder made from the bark of a tree found deep in the South American Andes. It was known as Jesuits' powder. The story of this medicine is an adventure in itself. Spanish Jesuit missionaries in Peru had learned from the indigenous Quechua people that the bark of the cinchona tree could miraculously cure the fevers that plagued them. The Jesuits began harvesting the bark, grinding it into a powder, and shipping it back to Europe. The active ingredient, which we now know as quinine, was incredibly effective at killing the malaria parasite in the bloodstream. It was the first effective chemical treatment for an infectious disease in history. By the 1650s, Jesuits' powder was being used in Rome and Spain with incredible success. It was hailed as a miracle drug, and crucially, it was available in London. One of Cromwell's own physicians, George Bate, had even written about it. They knew it existed. They knew it worked. So why, as Oliver Cromwell lay dying from malaria, did his doctors not give him the one thing that could save him? The answer lies in its name: Jesuits' powder. To Cromwell and his fiercely Protestant supporters, the Jesuits were the enemy. They were seen as agents of the Pope, conspirators, and the embodiment of the Catholic threat they had fought a bloody civil war to defeat. The idea of taking a popish powder promoted by Catholic priests was, for many Protestants, unthinkable. The medical establishment was deeply divided. Many English doctors were suspicious of this new-fangled foreign remedy. They preferred their traditional treatments of bleeding and purging, based on the ancient theory of the four humors. They dismissed the Jesuits' powder as quackery, or worse, a Catholic plot. There were rumors that it was a poison designed to kill Protestants. So Cromwell was trapped. He was trapped by his own ideology, by the religious bigotry of his era, and by the medical conservatism of his physicians. As he shivered and burned, a debate likely raged outside his sick room. Should they use the popish powder? The risk was immense. If they administered the Jesuits' bark and he died, they would be accused of poisoning him with a Catholic remedy. If they didn't, he would almost certainly die from the disease. They chose the safe path. They stuck to what they knew. They bled him. They gave him purgatives. They applied hot irons to his head. All of it was useless. All it did was weaken him further. As the great storm of September 3rd broke over Whitehall, mirroring the storm inside his body, Oliver Cromwell's life came to an end. He died on the anniversary of his two greatest military victories, a final grim irony. His death, from a treatable disease, highlights the powerful and often dangerous intersection of medicine, politics, and religion. Cromwell, the man who reshaped a nation based on his unshakable beliefs, may have become a victim of those very same beliefs. The irony is staggering. The Puritan leader who despised the Catholic Church was denied a cure because it came from the hands of Catholic missionaries. The story of Cromwell's death is a powerful reminder that knowledge is not the same as acceptance. Even when a cure exists, fear, prejudice, and ideology can be powerful enough to stand in its way. It's a tragic postscript to the life of one of history's most complex and controversial figures. By 1655, something about Oliver Cromwell had changed. Foreign diplomats, always watching, couldn't help but notice. The Venetian ambassador, writing in cipher back to his masters, observed that the Lord Protector looked drawn, with signs that his health was not stable. Then he added a small but telling detail. When Cromwell removed his hat in greeting, the hand holding it trembled. This is Oliver Cromwell we're talking about. The man who charged into cannon fire, who signed King Charles's death warrant without his hand shaking. Now at 56, he couldn't hold a hat steady. This tremor was just one symptom of the recurring fevers that struck him without warning. For months, he'd be fine, conducting state business, meeting his council, reviewing troops. Then the disease would return. First came the telltale shivering, a deep, bone-rattling cold, even in summer, even beside a roaring fire. Then the fever would spike, sending his temperature soaring until his clothes were drenched with sweat. The cycle repeated, cold, hot, each phase lasting for hours. His physicians called these episodes agues and considered them a natural hazard of English life. What they didn't understand was that each attack was actually billions of malaria parasites bursting from his red blood cells in synchronized waves, triggering his immune system into overdrive. Each bout left him weaker. Each recovery took longer. Meanwhile, Cromwell ruled England with increasing paranoia. He wore armor under his clothes, changed his travel routes at the last minute, and slept in different rooms each night. Some historians attribute this to a fear of assassination. And given that royalists were actively plotting to kill him, that fear was entirely justified. But consider this: chronic malaria is known to affect the brain. It can cause anxiety, paranoia, and severe mood swings. The very disease that was slowly killing his body was also poisoning his mind. Then, in June 1658, as London sweltered in an unusually hot summer, Cromwell received news that would shatter him more than any military defeat. His daughter, Elizabeth, was dying. Elizabeth Claypole, or Betty to her family, wasn't just any daughter. At 28, she was Cromwell's favorite child, and everyone knew it. While his other children embraced their father's stern Puritanism, Elizabeth had a different kind of strength. She was known for intervening with her father on behalf of imprisoned royalists, using her influence to secure pardons and reduce sentences. In many ways, she was his conscience. By late July, Elizabeth lay in Hampton Court Palace, her body ravaged by what physicians suspected was cancer. The timing couldn't have been crueler. Her youngest son, Oliver, had died just weeks earlier. Imagine being Cromwell, the most powerful man in 3 kingdoms, watching helplessly as his daughter suffered through a pain that all his power couldn't ease. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell spending hours at her bedside, praying and weeping openly, something almost unthinkable for a man of his position in that era. This wasn't the Lord Protector. This was a father watching his child slip away. Servants reported hearing him bargaining with God, offering his own life in exchange for hers. Then came the royalist propaganda. A rumor began to spread that would follow Cromwell to his own deathbed, that Elizabeth, in her final moments, had turned on her father, that she had accused him of having blood on his hands and begged him to repent for executing the king. Almost certainly this never happened. No reliable witness ever reported it. But the story spread because people wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that even Cromwell's own daughter saw him as a monster. On August 6th, Elizabeth died. Her body was taken by barge down the Thames to Westminster Abbey, the same journey her father's corpse would make just weeks later. Cromwell followed the barge on horseback, and witnesses said he seemed to age years in that single day. Less than 4 weeks after burying Elizabeth, Cromwell's final battle began. And this enemy couldn't be defeated with cavalry charges or artillery. It started innocuously enough. At the end of July, court observers noted the Lord Protector was suffering from gout. Nothing unusual there. Gout was practically a badge of honor among England's elite, proof that you ate rich food and drank good wine. But within days, everyone could see this was different. The pattern was terrifying in its familiarity. The malaria returned, but this time with a vengeance. 5 distinct attacks would strike him between late July and September 3rd, each one worse than the last. Between attacks, he would seem to recover, even conducting state business from his bed. These false recoveries were cruel, giving hope to his supporters and allowing his enemies to think he might survive. Let me paint you a picture of what these attacks actually looked like, based on eyewitness accounts. First came the shivering, so violent that the very bedframe shook. His teeth chattered uncontrollably. Servants piled blankets on him, but the cold was internal, a fireless winter in his bones. Then, the fever would hit. His skin would become scorching hot to the touch, his pulse racing as his body waged a losing war against the parasite. He'd be delirious, muttering about battles and prayers, lost in a world between life and death. Finally, the crisis, a drenching sweat that soaked his sheets and nightclothes, leaving him utterly exhausted, pale, and weak, but lucid. The fever had broken for now. During one of his brief periods of clarity, his physicians gathered around him. One of them, George Bate, asked if he wished to name a successor. Cromwell, weak but still in command, waved them away. "I shall not die of this bout," he insisted. "I am sure of it." He claimed to have received a revelation from God. This wasn't just false hope. It was a deeply held conviction rooted in his faith. He truly believed God would not let him die yet. His wife and counselors pleaded with him. His son, Richard, was the presumed heir, but the succession had never been formally declared. Finally, on the evening of September 2nd, as a storm of unprecedented fury gathered over London, Cromwell was heard to whisper a name, Richard. That night, the great storm of 1658 tore through England. Trees that had stood for centuries were ripped from the ground. Roofs were torn from houses. The wind howled with such ferocity that people believed it was the devil himself, come to claim the soul of the Lord Protector. Both his friends and enemies saw it as a supernatural event, a fittingly epic end for a man who had lived such a tempestuous life. The next morning, September 3rd, the storm had passed. The city was quiet. For Cromwell, this date was deeply significant. It was the anniversary of two of his greatest victories, the Battle of Dunbar and the Battle of Worcester. He had always considered it his lucky day. But as the day wore on, he slipped into a coma. His family and counselors gathered around his bed at Whitehall Palace. At around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, on his lucky day, Oliver Cromwell died. The man who had overthrown a king and forged a republic was gone. His final enemy, a microscopic parasite, had finally claimed its victory. His death left a power vacuum that his son Richard, a gentle country squire, could never hope to fill. Within 2 years, the protectorate would collapse, and the monarchy would be restored. The body of the man who trembled holding a hat would be dug up, hanged, and beheaded, a final brutal act of revenge from the regime he had fought so hard to destroy. The story of Cromwell's final days is more than just a medical history. It's a profoundly human tragedy. It shows us a man stripped of his power, his invincibility, and his health, reduced to a grieving father and a patient fighting a losing battle. It's a powerful reminder that even the most formidable figures in history are, in the end, vulnerable, just like the rest of us. They piled blankets on him, one after another. They stoked the fires in his chambers until the rooms were sweltering. But nothing could warm him. Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of England, was shivering uncontrollably, a deep, bone-rattling cold that no external heat could touch. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the cold would vanish, replaced by a raging inferno. His temperature would spike. Without modern thermometers, his physicians couldn't get an exact reading, but they noted his skin was burning to the touch. The sweating was relentless, soaking through his nightshirt, the bedsheets, even the thick mattress. His servants were constantly changing his bedding, sometimes multiple times a night. And then came the sickness. Violent bouts of vomiting and diarrhea left him unable to keep anything down, not even a sip of water. His throat grew raw from the constant heaving. A hacking cough developed, bringing up flecks of blood. But the worst part by far was the pain. This was a man who had endured the brutality of the English Civil War, a soldier who had seen battle and suffered wounds without complaint. Now he cried out in agony. He described the feeling as if his back and stomach were being torn apart from the inside. Modern medical analysis suggests this was likely his spleen, swelling grotesquely as it struggled to filter out the massive number of red blood cells being destroyed by the disease, pressing against his other organs. In the brief, lucid moments between these agonizing attacks, his mind would clear. He would dictate letters, discuss the future of the Commonwealth with his council, even manage a weak joke with his physicians. But each recovery was more fleeting than the last. Each new wave of fever and pain left him weaker, with less strength to fight the next one. He was caught in a vicious cycle, and everyone could see he was losing. Now this is where the story of Cromwell's death shifts from a tragic medical account to one of profound, dark irony. By the year 1658, European medicine had found a remedy for these kinds of fevers, what we now know as malaria. The cure was a botanical one, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree. It was often called Jesuit's powder. Why? Because Jesuit missionaries stationed in Peru had learned of its miraculous healing properties from the indigenous peoples there. They brought it back to Europe, and it worked. It had already saved countless lives across the continent. The active ingredient, which we now call quinine, specifically targets the malaria parasites in the bloodstream. Just a few doses could break the fever cycle and pull a dying patient back from the brink. And here's the crucial part. Cromwell's physicians knew about it. They almost certainly could have gotten their hands on it. Despite the religious turmoil of the era, medicine often crossed sectarian lines. England had trade routes, and this wonder drug was likely available within a day's ride of Cromwell's deathbed in London. The powder that could have saved the Lord Protector's life was within reach. But according to multiple historical sources, Cromwell refused to take it. The reason was a single word: Jesuit. This was a man whose entire identity was built on his fervent Protestant faith and his opposition to the Catholic Church. He saw the Pope as the literal Antichrist. He had led brutal campaigns against Irish Catholics and had outlawed Catholic worship in England. To accept a medicine discovered by Jesuits, distributed by Jesuits, and named after Jesuits? For Cromwell, it would have been a betrayal of everything he had fought for, everything he believed in. Just pause and think about that for a second. Imagine you are in his position. You are dying a slow, agonizing death. Your body is failing. Your beloved daughter has just died. The republic you fought to build stands on fragile ground, and a cure exists. A proven cure. But to take it, you have to accept help from your sworn enemies, the very people you've dedicated your life to fighting. What do you choose, your life or your principles? Now, to be fair, some modern historians argue this story of refusal is a myth, a piece of propaganda created by later writers to make Cromwell look like a stubborn fool. They point out that contemporary medical records don't definitively state that he was offered and then rejected the powder. But here is what we know for certain: he did not receive the treatment. Whether it was because he personally refused it out of principle, or because his staunchly Protestant physicians were unwilling to prescribe a popish powder to their leader, the result was the same. Oliver Cromwell, one of the most powerful men in the world, died of a disease that had recently become treatable. By September 2, 1658, everyone in his inner circle knew the end was near. His devoted valet, Charles Harvey, remained by his bedside, carefully recording his master's final words and prayers. These records give us an intimate, poignant window into Cromwell's last hours, and they reveal a man far different from the iron-willed tyrant his enemies portrayed. The night before he died, as a great storm raged outside, Harvey offered him something to drink. Cromwell's response was haunting. "It is not my design to drink or to sleep," he whispered, "but my design is to make what haste I can to be gone." He was ready. He was no longer fighting. Even as his body gave out, his mind remained sharp enough to wrestle with his legacy and his faith. He was heard praying, not for himself, but for the people of England. He grappled with the question of his own salvation, seeking assurance that he was one of God's chosen. He died the next afternoon, on September 3rd, the anniversary of two of his greatest military victories. A date he had always considered his lucky day. The man who had toppled a king, conquered nations, and reshaped a country was ultimately defeated not by an army on the battlefield, but by a microscopic parasite in his own blood, and perhaps by the unbending certainty of his own convictions. Have you ever wondered what goes through a powerful ruler's mind right before they die? 2 days before the end of his life, witnesses recorded a remarkable prayer from Oliver Cromwell. It shows he knew exactly how history might judge him. He said, "Lord, though I am a miserable and wretched creature, I am in covenant with thee through grace, and I will come to thee for thy people. Thou hast made me, though very unworthy, a mean instrument to do them some good." But then he said something that shocks everyone who thinks of Cromwell as just a tyrant without a conscience. He added, "And many of them have set too high a value upon me, though others wish and would be glad of my death." He knew that half of England wanted him dead, that they saw him as a usurper, a regicide, a man who had murdered his king. And here's what's truly astonishing. He prayed for those enemies. He said, "Pardon such as desire to trample upon the dust of a poor worm, for they are thy people too." The man who had shown no mercy at Drogheda, who signed King Charles I's death warrant without a second thought, spent his last coherent hours praying for the people who despised him. It's a contradiction that defines his entire life. The date of his death, September 3rd, was also deeply significant. This was Cromwell's lucky day. It was the anniversary of his two greatest military victories, the Battle of Dunbar in 1650 and the Battle of Worcester in 1651. Had often told people that God had marked this specific date for him, a sign of divine favor. Now, in a twist of fate, it would mark his end. It seemed that the date which had given him his power would now be the date that took it all away. The next morning, Cromwell could barely speak. Witnesses described him mumbling about God's will and England's future, but the words were becoming increasingly jumbled and incoherent. The fever, which had ravaged his body for weeks, had finally reached his brain. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Oliver Cromwell died. He was 59 years old. He had ruled England for 5 years, commanded armies for 15, and had irrevocably changed the course of British history. As Cromwell took his last breath inside Whitehall Palace, a massive storm raged outside. Witnesses described the winds as unprecedented for September. They tore through London, toppling ancient trees and ripping roofs clean off houses. The storm was so severe, so perfectly timed, that it immediately became part of the folklore surrounding his death. His enemies, the Royalists, claimed it was the devil himself, coming to collect Cromwell's soul. But his supporters saw it differently. They said it was God, mourning the loss of his most faithful servant. In all likelihood, it was just a coincidence, a powerful September gale that happened to arrive at a profoundly dramatic moment. But the story stuck. The storm became inseparable from the legend of Cromwell's death, a meteorological testament to the turmoil he represented. The very next morning, before the sun had fully risen, a team of physicians arrived to perform an autopsy on the Lord Protector's body. The procedure was led by Dr. George Bate, Cromwell's own personal physician. This is where things get a bit suspicious. Some historians believe that Bate was a secret royalist who might have actually hastened his patient's death. Whether that's true or not, what they found inside Cromwell's body was both revealing and repulsive. His lungs were found to be engorged with fluid, which explains the constant coughing and difficulty breathing he experienced in his final days. While the spleen was a normal size, Bate wrote that it was filled with matter that looked like the Lees of Oyl, that thick, black sludge you find at the bottom of old oil containers. This admission has only fueled the speculation and mystery that surrounds the final hours of one of England's most controversial figures. Imagine this. The most powerful man in Britain dies, and whispers immediately start swirling. Was it murder? The official cause of death was malaria, but in the suspicious atmosphere of 17th century England, people were looking for poison. They expected a conspiracy, a political assassination. What they found instead was far more grotesque and, in a way, far more humiliating. This is the story of Oliver Cromwell's bizarre and disastrous afterlife. When Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, died on September 3, 1658, the search for poison began almost immediately. An autopsy was performed, a standard procedure for a head of state, but one fraught with tension. Rumors were already spreading like wildfire that Cromwell had been murdered by his enemies, but the doctors found no evidence of foul play. They found disease, confirming the official story. After the autopsy came the embalming, and this is where things went horribly, catastrophically wrong. The embalmers, tasked with preserving the body for a grand state funeral, went to work. They wrapped Cromwell's corpse in 6 layers of wax cerecloth, a heavy treated fabric. They then placed it inside a lead shell, which was soldered shut to make it airtight. Finally, this lead container was enclosed in a massive wooden coffin, packed with sweet-smelling herbs to mask any unpleasant odors. On top of the coffin, they affixed a gilt copper plate with a Latin inscription identifying him as Oliver, Protector of the Republics. It was a procedure fit for a king, designed to ensure the Lord Protector's body would remain intact for the weeks of public viewing and the elaborate funeral to come. But it failed, spectacularly. Within days, it became chillingly clear that the preservation had not worked. Multiple historical sources confirmed that Cromwell's body began to swell. The pressure inside the sealed lead shell built up until, with horrifying force, the corpse burst. The putrefaction was so severe that the stench became unbearable. Think about the sheer horror of this. The smell was so potent that it seeped through 6 layers of wax cloth, a soldered lid shell, and a wooden coffin packed with herbs. The most powerful man in the nation, whose funeral was being planned as one of the most magnificent in English history, was literally exploding from decay. His body was rotting so badly that he had to be secretly buried just to hide the smell from the public. This presented the government with an unprecedented crisis. What do you do when the centerpiece of a major state event is a rapidly decomposing biohazard? The state funeral couldn't be cancelled. Too much had been invested, both politically and financially. The Commonwealth's stability depended on a smooth transition of power to Cromwell's son, Richard, and a grand funeral was a crucial part of projecting that strength and continuity. So they hatched a plan that was as audacious as it was deceptive. They would hold the funeral anyway, just without the body. Sometime between September 4th and September 23rd, most likely around September 10th, Cromwell's actual corpse was quietly taken to Westminster Abbey. There was no ceremony, no grand procession, no public witnesses. It was a quick, secret burial, done under the cover of night, driven by the desperate need to stop the nauseating stench from spreading any further across London. While the public believed their leader's body was being prepared for veneration, it was already in the ground. With the real body disposed of, the government needed a substitute. The solution lay in the hands of Thomas Simon, a renowned medalist and artist. Shortly after Cromwell died, and before the decay became too advanced, Simon had taken a death mask of his face. This was a common practice, but Simon's task was now urgent and unusual. He had to work quickly, using the wax mold to create a lifelike face for a stand-in. He even had to disguise the saw marks on the mask where the skull had been opened during the autopsy. To make the effigy seem more alive, he placed pads beneath the eyelids to make the sunken eyes of the deceased appear full and natural. From this carefully doctored mask, skilled craftsmen created an elaborate effigy. It was essentially a life-sized wooden doll with a wax face, meticulously modeled on Cromwell's features. This dummy was then dressed in royal splendor, purple velvet robes, ermine fur, and a crown resting near its head. A scepter was placed in one hand and an orb in the other. From September 18th to November 10th, this effigy lay in state at Somerset House in London. For weeks, thousands of people filed past in solemn lines, paying their respects to what they believed was the body of their great leader. They were all unwitting participants in a massive deception. The effigy was so convincing that foreign ambassadors, seasoned diplomats, wrote detailed reports to their home governments about viewing Cromwell's well-preserved body, never suspecting they were looking at an elaborate fake. The grand finale of this charade was the funeral procession itself, held on November 23, 1658. It was one of the most extravagant and costly funerals in English history. The procession took 7 hours to travel just over a mile through the streets of London, from Somerset House to Westminster Abbey. At the center of it all was the empty coffin. Remember, the real body was already buried. This empty box was carried on a magnificent chariot, accompanied by the wax effigy, which was now seated upright, looking out over the crowds. Thousands of mourners, representatives from every level of government, and a massive military escort followed. The whole spectacle cost a fortune and estimated £60,000, a sum the new Commonwealth government could barely afford. Not everyone was fooled or impressed. John Evelyn, a royalist diarist who secretly despised Cromwell, attended the funeral and wrote about it with bitter sarcasm. He described it as the joyfulest funeral that ever I saw. He noted with disdain that there was none that cried but dogs, which the soldiers hooted away with a barbarous noise. He painted a picture not of solemn mourning, but of a rowdy, disrespectful parade, with soldiers drinking and taking tobacco in the streets as they went. For Evelyn and other royalists, the grand funeral was not a tribute to a great leader, but a farcical and expensive display of illegitimate power made even more absurd by the secret they didn't even know. The guest of honor wasn't even there. The story of Cromwell's body is a powerful reminder that history is often stranger, and sometimes more disgusting, than we can ever imagine. History is full of strange and grisly tales, but few can match the bizarre 300-year journey of Oliver Cromwell's head. Imagine this. You're one of the most powerful men in English history. You've toppled a king, won a civil war, and ruled a nation. You die and are buried with all the pomp and ceremony of a monarch in Westminster Abbey, the final resting place of kings and queens. But your story doesn't end there. In fact, the strangest part is just beginning. Cromwell's body lay in its grand tomb for less than 3 years. In 1660, the monarchy was restored. Charles II, the son of the King Cromwell had helped to execute, was back on the throne, and Parliament was screaming for vengeance. They couldn't punish the living Cromwell, so they decided to do the next best thing: desecrate his corpse. On January 26, 1661, agents of the new regime arrived at Westminster Abbey. Their mission was simple: dig up the bodies of the men responsible for the king's death. Getting Cromwell out was tough. After years underground, his coffin had partially fused together, but they managed it. His body, along with those of 2 other key figures, was carted off to an inn. There, the corpses were put on display under guard, while crowds gathered outside, buzzing with anticipation for the grim spectacle planned for the next day. The date they chose was no accident. January 30th was the 12th anniversary of King Charles I's execution. It was poetic justice, or so they thought. The decomposed bodies, now in open coffins, were dragged on a sled through the streets of London to Tyburn, the public gallows for common criminals. The crowds were enormous. This wasn't just an execution. It was a piece of public theater, a brutal warning to anyone who might challenge the crown. At Tyburn, the corpses were hanged from the infamous triple tree gallows. They were left to swing in the winter air from morning until 4 in the afternoon. When they were finally cut down, the executioner began his grisly work. Cromwell's body, partially mummified after 3 years, was tough. It reportedly took 8 swings of the axe to sever the head from the shoulders. The headless bodies were then unceremoniously dumped into a pit beneath the gallows, a common grave for the city's executed criminals. But the heads? They received special treatment. They were impaled on 20-foot-long spikes and raised high above Westminster Hall, the very building where the trial of the king had taken place. There they would remain for decades, a constant decaying reminder of the price of rebellion. Cromwell's head stayed on that pike for over 20 years, slowly mummifying in the London air, becoming a grotesque local landmark. Then, sometime around the mid-1680s, a powerful storm swept through London and blew the head down. The story goes that a palace guard found it, recognized whose it was, and, instead of reporting it, decided to hide it up his chimney. And so began a truly bizarre 300-year odyssey. The head became a morbid collector's item, passing from person to person. In the 18th century, it was a star attraction in a museum of curiosities. By the 19th century, it was a traveling sideshow exhibit. You could pay 6pence to see the shrunken, leathery head of the so-called tyrant, Cromwell. It was bought and sold, studied and debated. Scientists authenticated it, and historians argued over its journey. Finally, after centuries of being a public spectacle, the head was given a final, dignified resting place. In 1960, it was secretly buried at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge Cromwell's old university. The exact location is kept a secret to this day, to prevent any further disturbance. After 300 years of wandering, Oliver Cromwell's head had finally found peace. But this posthumous drama raises another question. What actually killed the man himself? He died on September 3, 1658, but the cause has been debated for centuries. Today, modern medical analysis offers some fascinating insights. The leading theory points to a 1-2 punch of diseases. The main culprit was likely a severe form of malaria, which he probably contracted during his military campaigns in Ireland nearly a decade earlier. But it wasn't just malaria. A compelling theory proposed in 2015 suggests that Cromwell was suffering from both chronic malaria and typhoid fever at the same time. This deadly combination would have simply overwhelmed his system. The evidence fits perfectly. For years, Cromwell had suffered from cyclical fevers and bouts of illness. An autopsy performed after his death revealed an enlarged spleen, a classic sign of chronic malaria. What's medically fascinating about Cromwell's case is how it demonstrates malaria as a slow-burning chronic disease. It doesn't always kill quickly. Instead, it can hide in the body for years, lurking in the liver between attacks. With each recurrence, it weakens the host, destroys red blood cells, and puts immense strain on the organs, making the person more vulnerable to other infections. After 9 years of this internal war, Cromwell's body just couldn't fight anymore. Of course, his death wasn't just a medical event. It was the result of a perfect storm of circumstances in the summer of 1658. He was emotionally shattered by the recent death of his favorite daughter, Elizabeth. The immense stress of holding on to power in a politically unstable country was taking its toll on his immune system. And crucially, quinine, the effective treatment for malaria, was available at the time, but he either refused it or couldn't access it. This sealed his fate. Think about the political situation as Cromwell lay on his deathbed. The republic he had forged through civil war and held together by sheer force of will was already beginning to fracture. His chosen successor, his son Richard, was seen as weak and unprepared to rule. The army was getting restless, and royalist plots were bubbling just beneath the surface. Perhaps on some subconscious level, Cromwell's body knew what his mind couldn't admit. The revolution was failing. His death was not just the end of a man. It was the beginning of the end for his entire political project. The chaos that followed his death paved the way for the restoration of the monarchy, and set the stage for the bizarre, 3-century-long postscript to his life. There's something almost mythological about Oliver Cromwell dying on September 3rd. It was his special day, the anniversary of his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester. His supporters saw it as a sign of divine providence, a final seal of God's favor. His enemies, however, saw it as divine justice. The tyrant finally struck down. The timing was so perfect, so poetically neat, that some historians have wondered if the date was manipulated, if he actually died on September 2nd or 4th, and the record was simply changed for symbolic effect. But the contemporary accounts are all consistent. September 3rd, 1658, around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The contrast between Cromwell's power in life and his utter powerlessness in death is staggering. This was the man who had dissolved Parliament with soldiers, who had made the monarchs of Europe tremble. He built a navy that challenged the Dutch for supremacy of the seas and humbled the mighty Spanish Empire. Yet, in his final days, he was so weak he couldn't even keep down a sip of water. His own body was consuming itself, while a potential cure sat just out of reach. Even his final journey was a disaster. The man who should have received the grandest funeral in English history, the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth, suffered a far grimmer fate. His body, ravaged by fever and the frantic, useless treatments of his doctors, began to rot so quickly and so badly that it had to be hidden away. The magnificent state funeral that the public witnessed was a complete sham. The coffin contained a dummy, a substitute made of wax and wood, dressed in his clothes and adorned with the symbols of his power. Even in death, Cromwell was replaced by a fake, a stand-in for the real thing. But the humiliation didn't end there. Just over 2 years later, after the monarchy was restored, his enemies exacted their final ghoulish revenge. On the anniversary of King Charles I's execution, Cromwell's body, along with those of 2 other regicides, was dug up from Westminster Abbey. His corpse was dragged through the streets of London on a sledge to the public gallows at Tyburn. There it was hanged like a common criminal until sunset. Then it was cut down and his head was severed from his body. It reportedly took 8 messy blows of the axe to get the job done. The man who had overseen the first public execution of an English king now suffered his own, 3 years after he had already died. And what happened to his head? It was stuck on a 20-foot pike and displayed above Westminster Hall, a gruesome warning to any who might challenge the crown. It stayed there for over 20 years, becoming a bizarre tourist attraction. People would point it out, a curiosity against the London skyline. After a storm finally blew it down, it began a strange 300-year journey. It was passed from a soldier to a museum owner, became a private collector's item, and was even sold for profit. The head of the Lord Protector became a piece of macabre memorabilia. It's astonishing to think how differently English history might have unfolded. What if Cromwell had lived? Just 5 more years could have changed everything. His son and chosen successor, Richard, was not the forceful leader his father was. He needed time to establish his authority, to win the loyalty of the army and the politicians. If Oliver had lived longer, perhaps Richard could have grown into the role. The Commonwealth, England's brief republican experiment, might have stabilized and endured. The monarchy might never have been restored, or at least not so quickly and completely. The entire political landscape of Britain, and by extension the world, could have been reshaped. But history doesn't bow to what-ifs. The course of the nation was altered not by a political plot or a lost battle, but by something microscopic and relentless. The malaria parasites multiplying in Cromwell's bloodstream didn't know or care they were killing the most powerful man in Britain. They were simply following their biological imperative: reproduce, spread, and survive. He likely contracted the disease during his campaigns in the marshy bogs of Ireland in 1649, and in killing Cromwell, almost a decade later, those parasites effectively killed the Commonwealth. The restoration of King Charles II in 1660 was, in a very real sense, made possible by a mosquito bite. This is what makes his death so historically significant. It wasn't an assassination, it wasn't a battlefield defeat, it wasn't even the gentle decline of old age. It was a disease. A preventable, treatable disease that brought an end to an entire political system and put a king back on the throne. The specific medicine that might have saved him was quinine, known then as Jesuits' powder because Jesuit missionaries had brought it back from Peru. But Cromwell was a devout, uncompromising Puritan. He saw the Jesuits as agents of the Pope, his ultimate enemy. He was deeply suspicious of anything associated with Catholicism. So, when his doctors suggested this new Catholic cure, he refused it. His religious prejudice, the very core of his identity, may have sealed his fate. He died of a curable illness because he couldn't bring himself to accept help from a source he despised. His final days were horrific by any measure. There was the immense physical suffering, the recurring cycles of chills and burning fevers, the pain, the delirium. There was the emotional anguish. Just weeks before his own decline, he had lost his favorite daughter, Elizabeth, to cancer. He was grief-stricken and vulnerable. He also knew his enemies were celebrating his agony, praying for his demise. And then there was the posthumous humiliation we've already described. The rotting corpse, the fake funeral, the exhumation, the hanging, the beheading, and his head on a pike for a generation. Yet through all this horror, something of Cromwell's true character seems to shine through in the deathbed prayers recorded by his valet. He wasn't praying for his own relief. He was praying for the people of England. He even prayed for his enemies, acknowledging that many wished him dead, but asking God to forgive them. Whatever you think of him, and historians are still fiercely debating whether he was a hero or a villain, a liberator or a tyrant, he died as he had lived, utterly convinced he was an instrument of God's will, preoccupied not with his own suffering, but with the fate of the nation. A great storm raged across England as he lay dying, a tempest so fierce it became part of his legend. His supporters said nature itself was weeping for its loss. His enemies claimed the devil had come to collect the tyrant's soul. But the real storm, the final, fatal storm, was the one raging inside his own body. It was the final fever that broke on the afternoon of September 3, 1658. And when it passed, it took with it not just Oliver Cromwell, but the entire English Commonwealth. Within 2 years, the king was back, and Cromwell's corpse was hanging from the gallows. That 300-year journey of his head from a pike to a museum to a curiosity shop to its eventual, secret burial in the 20th century is perhaps the perfect metaphor for how history has treated Cromwell himself. We've been unable to let him rest, constantly re-examining, reinterpreting, and literally holding him up for public inspection. Even today, the location of his head's final resting place is a secret, known only to a select few. It's as if, even in the 21st century, Oliver Cromwell remains too controversial, too powerful a figure to truly rest in peace. The horrific end of Oliver Cromwell is a stark reminder that power, no matter how absolute, cannot defeat death. The Lord Protector, who had conquered kingdoms and brought a king to the executioner's block, could not conquer the parasites in his own blood. In the end, he died as he had lived, powerful, pious, and uncompromising to the very last, even when a small compromise might have saved his life and changed history forever. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as fascinating as I do, please hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the dramatic moments that shaped our world. See you next time.